you would have one impression of the Russian people if you met them in public places, talked to them in official capacities. But if you went home and talked to them privately, they'd give you a completely different story. And I'm pretty sure that's probably the case today. It's just we're not hearing those private concerns because people are afraid to speak out.
He has also turned his attention to Ukraine. He famously said that he would end the sort of Ukraine war in sort of 24 hours. That has not happened. What do you make of where things are with ending the Ukrainian war, Bridget?
Well, that was a bit on my mind. He spent a lot of political capital on Ukraine trying to encourage Russia to have incentives to reach some sort of ceasefire and then a peace deal, and it didn't work. So he turned his attention away from there to the Middle East. The problem with Ukraine and Russia is that though the United States may have leverage on Ukraine, after all, they rely on American weaponry, and America's most important member of NATO, which is supporting them in their fight. But there is limited leverage over Vladimir Putin. And it's very striking when you look at the position of the Russian president. He hasn't really changed his demands of what he wants. He wants Ukraine to be neutral. He wants to retain the land that Russia controls. He wants Zelensky gone. The Russians say they want elections. That means they want Zelensky gone. And most importantly, he doesn't want to have any peacekeeping force on the ground, which involves NATO troops. So although Keir Starmer has been involved in trying to put together a coalition of the willing, there's been a lot of talk about that and how far the Americans would back it up. It's a sort of non-starter if the Russians say that they consider that will be a hostile act. So we haven't got very far with Vladimir Putin on this. And that leads one to think the only way that this war is going to end is through the process of attrition. And that brings us to, well, what would wear down Ukraine? And the Russians are now pounding energy supplies to try and sabotage their political will even further during these cold winter months. And what's going on inside Russia? How far is the Russian economy suffering? And that's a long game. And there it could become important if at some point the Americans, Donald Trump, decides the only way to push Putin towards a peace deal is, instead of giving carrots, is to give sticks, heavier economic sanctions or more weaponry to Ukraine. Would that make a difference? It might do, but it's very difficult to second guess the Russians on this one because, as we've seen time and again, think back to the Second World War, they have enormous powers of endurance and their political leaders have an immense capacity to allow their people to suffer to get what they want.
And look, you have spent a considerable amount of your career in Russia, living in Moscow, and you interviewed President Putin twice. What was he like up close? What were your impressions of him?
He's quite thin-skinned. He doesn't like criticism. He's very confident when it comes to security matters, will talk eloquently without a brief. Less sure of himself on the minutiae of the economy. This is a man who trained as a KGB officer, so security was his bread and butter. He's quite suspicious of people who don't share his interests. So now people translate that into paranoia about outside enemies and indeed internal enemies. When I met him, he was still at the very beginning of his time in office, and the first time I interviewed him, he'd only been in power a year and was still a little bit insecure, unsure of himself in answering some questions. I interviewed him again 5 years later. By now, the Russian economy was doing quite well. Oil prices had soared, and this had hugely boosted the Russian economy, and he was much more confident and therefore much more prickly and much less willing to give ground on anything. So I think the state of the Russian economy and the feeling that ordinary Russian people might have about how well their country is doing or not is important, though possibly these days it's less important than it used to be because he has such a stranglehold over the country politically.
And that's what I wanted to go on to ask you. I mean, you've spent a lot of time living in Moscow. I mean, you're not there, obviously you're in Cheltenham now. But what do you think is the secret to understanding Russia as a country and as a people. As you say, President Putin has a real stranglehold on media. There isn't a free and fair press. It's quite a controlled society. But do you get the impression that there is any sense of the public tiring with President Putin or tiring with this war? Or do you think his sort of propaganda machine is sufficiently robust to make people still think he's the best leader and believe in him?
Well, it's difficult to read opinion polls in Russia now because no Russian can give an honest answer to an opinion pollster. But you can look at the difference between different questions that are asked over a period of time, and there does seem to be an indication that people would like the war to end. And it's not surprising, really. The biggest worry for them must be their young men, their brothers, their sons, their husbands being sent off to the war and losing their lives. And there are residual worries about the economy and how the war might affect prices, inflation, joblessness, and so forth. But I think the main thing, the key to understanding Russia, and this was certainly true when I first went there in the Soviet era, is you mustn't conflate the Russian people with their government. There is President Putin and his close cohorts who are working together and pursuing this war in Ukraine and being very brutal against internal critics too. And then there are ordinary Russian people who are trying to survive. And I remember very well when I first used to go there in the 1970s and 80s, you would have one impression of the Russian people if you met them in public places, talked to them in official capacities. But if you went home and talked to them privately, they'd give you a completely different story. And I'm pretty sure that's probably the case today. It's just we're not hearing those private concerns because people are afraid to speak out. And they have hunkered down, gone into, as one Russian once put it to me, gone into internal exile. So they think these thoughts in their head, but they don't risk to say them or say them on the telephone or on the internet or in any kind of communication, electronic or otherwise. So until things change in Moscow, until President Putin is no longer leader and there is an opportunity for something to shift, we probably won't find out the full story of what Russian people think about all this.
Well, look, Bridget, it's been absolutely fascinating catching up with you and getting your thoughts, particularly right now, and there's so much happening on the international front. And I know you're doing a big talk at the Cheltenham Literature Festival. Thank you so much for your time.
Glad to be with you. Thank you, Aisha.
That's Bridget Kendall there. And I think she ends on a really, really important point about how it's really important to not conflate citizens and people with their government's actions. And I think that's a really, really important reflection, whether it's people from Russia, Palestinians, people conflate sort of Hamas with all Palestinians. And of course, Israelis as well. People often make the mistake of conflating, all Israelis or all Jewish people with the actions of what the Israeli government is doing. So I think that's a kind of a very sensible reminder from Bridget Kendall there.